Welcome to Classical Chats. I'm Tiffany. Today we have an interdisciplinary artist, Irina Ideas, who's actually right now in Montenegro. Such a beautiful place when she filmed a video introducing herself to me. And I'm very excited to talk to her because she used to be a classical pianist. And now she creates these really interesting art projects that involves paintings, one of which series was inspired by Bach's Goldberg Variations. She has a lot of philosophical thoughts and inspirations that go into how she creates her art, and I'm very interested in sharing her journey with all of you. Hope you enjoy this episode. Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much for doing this. Actually, it's incredibly inspiring. I've been checking a lot of your videos, and it inspired me to practice. You know, that struggle to practice
Yeah.
oftentimes, and we all suffer from that. And I think, and also, it's quite connected, I think, to my vision about this world, to open source, to just share. You know what the behind the scenes, the human aspect, not only the perfected, which has been the case previously, but now technology is allowing us all of this. So I'm super excited. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm definitely very excited to hear about your inspirations because I know you have a background in philosophy and you're very interested in technology and the way it changes our experience with music. So we'll definitely get into that. But let's start off from the very first question that I ask every single classical chat guest, which is how did your journey with classical music begin?
Okay, so the very beginning, right? So
Yes.
I was actually I didn't start very early. I was maybe because I was exposed to the classical music and the art world in general. Not so much my parents, but my grandparents on the paternal side. They are white Russians, and they had very wide education, and they were doing ballet and also the classical music and the painting. My grandmother was quite a lot into the painting world, and then maybe because of that, I had a little bit of resistance. I'm not going to, start doing the music, but then around maybe age 8 or 9, I started with just a very classical education. It started with the competitions, the concerts, everything, the usual. Then enrolling the academy very early, and all of that. And still, I was always kind of infused with other art forms, but I still thought, it's normal now. I have to be a classical music classical pianist, and that's what I should do. So that's how it all started, but then it kind of developed in all sorts of directions. I was like at first I was always interested in so many things. I never thought, oh, it's just, I have to be perfecting this, although I was exposed to that kind of environment and everything that goes with it. And but I was always reading, and always I had sort of stages about in which I wanted to learn so many things different, and then also between the different visual arts. And I remember my parents were puzzled in so many aspects, saying, what's going on? This should just, did a different, there should be a cross in career, differences. So that's basically the beginning. And it was a little bit confused, I think, but at the same time, it was traditional as far as it can go. So
Right. And then you eventually found your passion in other disciplines, not just the classical pianist
yes,
career
right.
and the usual path. So, what was that transition like? I know
Yes.
it was a lot of confusion and you were interested in many things, but do you remember like a turning point?
Yes, actually, it's a very excellent question, because it's this is all happening before the mainstream internet. So I didn't have access to the internet before that, and suddenly I remember when I enrolled the music academy at the age of 15, and I was exposed to all of this kind of competitive. There was a lot of that sort of stuff. I mean, the good side and the bad side, we all know about that. And then I had just a phase. I'm in the midst of preparing the concerts and everything, and I have a phase of I want to do a series of sculptures. And as I was always exposed to the art world in the visual sense and all this kind of the painters and sculptors and so on. So I asked one of the French sculptors to just provide to supply me with water-based clay, and so she did. And so I brought home about 20 kilos of water baked
Oh
clay,
wow.
and then I just created for myself a little studio at the second half of my room. And my mother was like like this, did you really miss? Why are you doing all this work with the piano and practicing, and then still you are creating serious sculpture? So I think that was the probably the most important point where I realized I just had this striving. I had this sense that I need to create something that's other than what I'm already used to creating. And I perceived this at that point. I was about 16, 17. I was already well into the music. I was starting to understand, and also very serious repertoire. And then I realized I want to express what I'm perceiving through music, through some kind of a visual form. So sculpture was very close to me. And then after that, so at that point, I was kind of having ups and downs with the other forms of art. I was still going back to music as the most dominant. And then I had my education abroad throughout Europe and in America. And that also kind of directed me in different directions. And then I had the stages with philosophy. I was always reading philosophy. I thought that, with music is a kind of philosophy, as if you're reading some kind of a very deep book where there is so many layers. And that's how I perceive. And it was always enriching when, especially in connection to some composers. And I mean, it's somehow it was the puzzle that was getting together slowly and through various roads that were going in all directions. And and then so I did a lot of I was actually studying psychology alongside the music when I was in America. And I was even doing some coding at some stages with computers, because I was absolutely fascinated. I'm
Oh wow.
delighted with technology. And yes, so that's basically it. In the yeah, I think it was that point at the age of 16. And then it was kind of a slow transition, which was bringing me away from music and back to music, and away from other arts and so on and so forth. Then I also had a bit of ideas about ecology. I was starting to be aware about how these macroeconomics is happening, how is the world. I was doing so many courses learning about so many things, the civilization. I remember I was doing this course with I forgot the first name, Harari, the famous book Sapiens. It was called Sapiens. It's talking about the history of a civilization. And at that stage, I was very much interested in just the trajectory, why are we progressing the way we are as a species. And then it's actually, I think I found my balance between all of these only about 6 or 7 years ago. Then I kind of
Oh
started to
wow.
balance. Yes. Before that, it was
Wow.
a lot of search.
Yeah, because it seems like remind our listeners and those who don't know you where you were born and where you are right now.
Oh,
Because it seems
absolutely.
like your
Yes.
travels
Right.
influenced a lot of your discovery and your journey.
Yes.
So
Yes.
you were
So I was born in Montenegro. It's a tiniest country in Southeast Europe, former part of Yugoslavia, just in case, because it's not well known. But it's so beautiful. There are mountains. I'm
yeah.
literally in here. In fact, even for this conversation, I was thinking maybe I should do it outside on a beautiful balcony, but unfortunately, it's about to rain, so I can't do that.
Oh
But I'm literally in between the two mountains and the sea in front, so it's very beautiful. But I'm
yeah.
here actually by the accident of pandemia that happened. So I was actually scheduled to do a lot of art residencies and the exhibitions and a lot of art activities throughout the world. And that all is postponed until further notice. We'll see. So I'm all in with the online activities, which is also not bad, I suppose. We just have to
Mm.
transform. Yes.
Yeah, but it seems like you've traveled around the world and now you're back into this beautiful place. I remember from your video introducing yourself, I was so fascinated, just so gorgeous. You were in this mountains, and yeah,
Yes,
I
that's
was
actually on my
really
balcony. That's
feeling-
literally
yeah,
over there. It's so
that's
inspiring.
amazing.
In fact, I think probably in terms of my sculpture, some of the work, because you see, I am absolutely fascinated with the Gothic architecture since the early childhood,
Hmm.
and then it's accident that I was born in Montenegro, and actually I'm not Montenegrin. Also, for some, my parents are from different, so I wasn't born in the same culture, but the fact that there are so many mountains, that these stones are almost shaped, they are each a sculpture of their own. And then there is so much history, so much mythology in this place that has been touched by so many nations, like and the empires, and there was a lot of power struggles. So all of that I'm trying to kind of encompose in the art. And I think that through visual art, I can capture a lot of that aspect. So
So walk me through, very simply, walk me through your process if it's possible, because it seems like so many things inspire you, and I can also understand this. It can be a bit chaotic for me to understand the process. Like I can't tell people how I interpret a piece of music from point A to
right,
the day before the concert, for example. But if you were to simplify your process in some uh step by step, how would you describe it? So let's say you want to create a sculpture.
right.
Where does that process begin? How does it go on into becoming the sculpture at the end?
That's a super deep and difficult question. Actually, it
I know.
requires thinking. So yes, it's. I think it really depends on the stage I'm at, because I think that there is this transformation, and even when I look at myself just a year or 2 years ago, and then I look at the paintings, there's so much difference. But I think. Lately, maybe since I've kind of created the balance between all of these, the expressions that I'm trying to capture, it's very spontaneous. I would say that I sometimes rely on what I'm obsessing with when it comes to the process, and that's in my artist statement. It's actually the time. Time is something that I'm super interested in, and the transformation it makes. Like there is absolutely nothing that's more powerful than the time in this world. We can't slow it down. We can maybe freeze things with technology, especially a little bit, but so that's always in my mind. And how is it affecting, whether it's the sculpture, how will this sculpture be making an imprint on the future? That's also something that's a lot in my mind, on the basis of what I've been reading for years in the futurism and how technology is changing us. So I think that it's to just simplify it, it also relies a lot on the intuition. I did my
Mm.
DNA, and turns out I have some Eskimo genetics, which is
Mm.
super shocking. But then I was reading a little bit, and turns out that the Eskimo is one of the most resourceful ethnicity, obviously in the of all, because they had to survive in such a cold, extreme climate. And I'm thinking. Maybe that's something which kind of I just know when is the right moment to do something, and then it just flows. It's very difficult to explain, and maybe
Yeah.
yes, and maybe
What about with your Goldberg variations? I mean, there must have been a point when you were really obsessed with that
yes. Actually,
particular piece,
that
and such an unusual piece of music because it's there were stories about whether it was written for king, I think, to fall asleep
right.
better, but it's such a complex but also very simple in that it's just one theme that it everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people know, and then it gets more and more complicated into all these different tonalities. So how does that translate, if that's even a good term for it? I don't think so, but how does that become a visual interdisciplinary project for you just from that musical composition?
Right, excellent question. So, this has been a very long process actually with Goldberg Variation, because about I think 5 years ago I did the Art of Fugue. I did the full professional recording of, and that took me 2 years, alongside all of the other things I've been doing, and that is a totally different kind of piece. It's a totally different sphere that the Bach was in. I think when composing, it's really incredibly powerful. And then Goldberg Variation has been at the back of my mind all the way until I think since I first heard it, maybe from the early teens, and uh,
Mm.
and then throughout the education, I was kind of always approaching it, and then I would back off. It's not the right
Oh.
time. It was kind of like that because I was playing so many. I would say Bach is one of my obsessions in general. I've played so many of the well-tempered piano and then chromatic fantasy and fugue. I enjoyed so much, and I
Mm.
mean so many pieces. And I always thought, Goldberg Variations is something exactly as you said. It seems simple, and especially because there's so much mystery about it. Is that a piece dedicated to insomnia? Something so maybe even to entertain. Is that a commission? Is that a sacrifice? How do we classify it? And so all of these question marks were kind of creating the reflection in my mind. How am I going to play this to the full of the in a most fulfilling way? And then I realized, okay, so maybe I should, because these are the very short pieces, each one is telling its own story, and this is something I also been going with the contrapunctuses of the art of fugue. So about each contrapunctus, I was put a little note, and now relying on philosophy because that's a really deeply philosophical piece in my opinion. So I would have that little note, and that would make me almost induce some kind of vision, I don't know, a reverie or something, some in a
Mm.
different world, just thinking about it. And then, of course, when you're practicing, it's just staying with you when you're not practicing, and then the life is going through, and I'm thinking about the different ways. And this came very, very spontaneously. So it happened in November. We were still in full lockdown with the
Mhm.
pandemic last 2020 November. And I said, okay, now I'm starting this. And I remember it was still nice weather, so I was able to even do a few of those paintings in the outdoors, and I was still practicing and learning all of this. And I was trying to open source every aspect of it. So most of those processes while I was painting, I would be live streaming to the audience.
Oh.
Yes, so that was, and then also trying to interact. So sometimes it was confusing, sometimes it was very inspiring, but it felt like a little bit. Maybe I have this idealism that maybe Bach felt a little bit of struggle how to join together material and immaterial, because we live in the material world, but we are always striving to touch something immaterial. So and that kind of inspired me to do, and most of actually it's what you see here is the final one. And right before this,
Ah.
I finished the number 30 and the aria, the final recording of the audio side of it. So that's why it was here, because I was doing a bit of videoing of the whole process. And so they are done very fast, action painting, maybe 1 hour each of these, and there is 30.
Oh.
And yeah, so I'm always the process now, how I do this. I usually start with thinking about each variation. Again, I dedicated this kind of idealism. What is it saying? What message? One of them was beauty in the eyes of beholder. Sorry, I totally messed it. The beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. Did I? Yes, it was okay. For
Yeah.
example, and then so there are many others, like all of 30, and then I wrote a little piece as well. So it's a very kind of interdisciplinary. I think that's the most interdisciplinary of the projects I've done lately. And I was really, really enjoying it. And but this I think that the most interesting question is about the intersection between material and immaterial. And indeed, if it was a commissioned piece, then it was a kind of a sacrifice. Bach had to sacrifice, creating something for some. I think it was a duke or a king, exactly as you said, from Russia, something like that. But then, of course, uh, um, this is all
Speculation.
historical guessing, because we
Yeah.
lost back for 200 years, which is
Yeah.
pity, just the way. Yeah.
So it's fascinating because when I think of Bach's music, I think of the Baroque times, maybe a bit similar to Versailles, like very golden, aristocratic, that kind of era, and then I look at the painting that is supposed to be variation 30th, right? The 30th, or is it the aria, or is it both?
Uh,
The painting behind you.
no, the piece behind me is the last one. It's the number 30. It's the
The
Ode to
number 30,
Joy,
yeah.
Schiller. I for some reason,
Ah.
for some reason, that one, I don't know why, but just the music is associating me, not to Beethoven's Ode to Joy, but to Schiller's. Just what he's saying, Ode to Joy, to be in togetherness, to finally, I don't know, maybe. And I've been thinking a lot, if this was the piece, obviously we know that it was published during the Bach's lifetime. And I'm even thinking, did Bach try to adopt it so that it's a message to the humanity? Maybe he tried also to send some kind of a message. Maybe that's why. So all of that interpretation is purely my imagination, what could have been. But I think maybe I'm also taking the concept of interpretation a little bit further, because I'm getting it into the world of the visual. And obviously, the paintings are all in the abstract style. I'm most comfortable doing this, and especially with the action painting, where I'm trying to do a stream of consciousness. And I'm sometimes thinking that maybe Bach also, I mean, such a master. And now in 20th century, we have James Joyce, who is going into the stream of consciousness, and we consider him one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. And maybe Bach even entered that with such a mastery of polyphony. So I'm just thinking, but of course it was placed in the language. I don't know. We all have different visions, and then of course in visual sense, Baroque has so much. How to say, a lot is piled up. I think this sense of infinity. So in that aspect, maybe it's connected to my obsession with time. I don't know. It's
Oh, that's very interesting because for Baroque, I always think very musically, it's very structured, and maybe visually, I don't know much about art history, but from what I remember, there's a lot of, you mentioned like piled up, but kind of like a lot of ornamentation and structure is kind of what I associate with
right.
Baroque.
Yes. Well,
And so I never thought of stream of consciousness because stream of consciousness is usually something that I encounter in the Romantic era. Starting, I'm reading and very obsessed with German Romanticism, and you read characters just revealing their thoughts, and it's so interesting to read about their stream of consciousness or read their of consciousness where it's a blend between reality and their imagination.
right.
So to me, I never really thought of Baroque music as having streams of consciousness through its polyphony, which, if I'm understanding you correctly, is kind of how you see Bach's music or see or hear Bach's music.
Yes, I'm thinking. Actually, you're right. Your interpretation is excellent. With connecting it with the romantic period and all of the imagination and everything that's going on. But I'm actually thinking more in the sense of the so many layers, because with the stream of consciousness,
Mm.
the way I perceive, especially in relation to. Actually, I'm not that familiar with the romantic. I have a little bit of a rebellious nature when it comes to romantic and classical.
Oh,
So
how
I
come?
avoid that. So I
Oh.
systematically avoid both in reading and also in playing the music. So while I was playing some Chopin and Schumann and all of that, I also avoid it a lot. So very rebellious student.
But that's interesting. Well, because Schiller is part of that romanticism.
Yes,
Well, my
philosophically.
aspect of it, right? Philosophical.
Philosophically, I divert a little bit, but when it comes
Ah,
to music, I was a little bit, even at the quite early stage. I remember I had almost fierce fights with my professor with Liszt. I didn't want to play Liszt. There was almost like, it won't happen.
ah,
He was trying to
fascinating.
make me, do all of the etudes. And of course, I
Mm.
admire, especially his later period. And probably I'm going to be eventually be recording it sometimes and spending some time with. But yeah, it was. I don't know. It was it was a strange transformation. So just to go back to the before I totally divert. Yes, about the
Yeah, the
stream
stream
of
of
consciousness.
consciousness.
So I'm thinking more in the context of surfacing something that's in deeper layers, and then sometimes it's very abstract. And even in Bach's music, in the polyphonical, we sometimes see the the dissonances and the structure that's definitely not common in is really jumping sometimes in a totally something different. And I'm thinking maybe he's entering that subconscious layers. And for me also it's very important with the painting to get into that layer. And usually what's happening, and of course here is the discrepancy, because with the polyphony it takes a lot of thinking, to put together. It's almost like a maze. But I'm thinking maybe it's kind of I don't. It's like exactly like a maze. Just what did I want to say? This is
No,
typical.
yeah, no, I love this conversation because it's not every day that I get to talk to someone who has that philosophical interest and intertwined with their interest in music and obviously strong passion for music. So this is very fascinating for me and gives me kind of nostalgic flashbacks of my college days when I was studying philosophy and trying to understand consciousness in other classes that had nothing to do with music, but also thinking about it while I was reading things in literature classes that had nothing to do with music necessarily. But it seems like your idea, or your way of thinking of consciousness or stream of consciousness is more of the Freudian concept of having like the different layers.
Yes,
And to me, I think of stream of consciousness as this free flowing, not so much structured way of looking at life or looking at themselves internally. So I think it's just a little bit different how we
right.
look at the term and what we associate with stream of consciousness. Because I would not really think, again, I think I just so stuck in this thinking of Bach being very mathematical, so very planned, and it's interesting for me to think of it as just having different layers, because
And
then it seems like there's a separation between the material and the immaterial, what is on the surface, but then how do you determine what is on the surface as opposed to underneath?
that's very difficult. Well, that's where art comes in. Actually, that's what we can't
Yeah.
explain. I think. What is it? What's the image? How do we touch it? And what is it that's touching and that's making us do the things? So and also to connect a little bit to the what you when you mentioned Freud, in fact it's more Jungian, because I'm absolutely fascinated with the mythology, with the archetypes, with the historical.
Mm.
And so every so often I read some kind of a book about, I don't know, the Roman empires and how it has been, how it was functioning, not so much in the historical, when was the battles and who was winning what territory and all of that, but more in the way of like. And that's also a book that maybe if somebody's interested I could recommend. It's a super brilliant, is the Roman times, from the Roman times to the Byzantine, history of the private life between the Roman and the Byzantine periods. It has several authors. They're all historical historians, and it's very very insightful into the way, into as you said, into what's the imagination, what was the belief system that made them do things the way they would like to do, and what was really conducting the way of life, how exotic all of that might have been to us. And so all these aspects, and also a lot of the Campbellian thinking of the mythology and all of the concept of heroes. We all have some kind of ideal within our mind that we tried, and I think that's also what you often say: keep striving, go forward, reach that. And yeah, and so it's just, I don't know, it's always about the depth, I think, and maybe that's where we find those layers. And with the music, it's slightly different, because, and maybe that's also one of the reasons that I started that I started with the obsession with my time and movement and the transformation, because music is happening in time, and but we have to think in space. That's interesting when we are, learning the piece, and we have all of these aspects, how do we put it together, and how do we merge with it. So there is this sense of merging, and maybe that's how we can touch upon the immaterial, but I don't think we can ever separate it while we are in this body, because it's like it's like a coin. It has two faces, and one is always invisible to us, this immaterial, even though we are constantly seeing that maybe the surface, maybe it's the platonic world where we are imagining the that's also what's fascinating, I think, with
Hmm.
the ancient Greek philosophers. I don't know, Heraclitus is my favorite, again about the change. He famously said you can never step in the same river twice. And so there is kind of a verticality. Maybe that's how I can explain it. Maybe it's the way, just seeing the world in a more vertical sense, going in and that's also in coordination with the Gothic, my obsession with the Gothic architecture, and with the Baroque. I don't know. It's somehow, for me personally, Baroque is more connected to 20th century. I don't know how do you feel about that?
In what way?
Just in the way of, even though it's a completely different language in both music and visual arts, I think in the way of trying to find the depth. I don't know how to explain it. It's still beyond the words. And then, so in that sense, I don't know, it's just I think because 20th century has more piled up. It's more crowded. It's not as I perceive romantic and classical more as perfection, symmetry. Everything is so balanced. And then when we reach the 20th century, it's kind of a bit outside. I don't know, maybe it's just my own.
It's it's completely not how I've always thought of it. I always thought of I'm not sure romanticism is very balanced out, but I still am so stuck in that thinking of Baroque being structure, classical more stuff in between, for lack of better words, and you have more freedom of, like, for example, in music there's a lot more modulations that go more and more extended. For example, with Beethoven's music, you see more and more drama in the music through the changes of keys, and tonalities get more complex. And then you reach romanticism, things go a lot crazier, virtuosic elements come in showing individuality. And then comes the more contemporary 20th century, where there's a lot of resistance and rebellion against structure to really break from
Right.
tonality. Atonal music comes up, and there's a lot of struggle in the music that I hear, generally speaking, of 20th century, and to really try to expand the boundaries. So for me, it's always been the opposite side of Baroque, where everything is neat and tidy, kind of. But it definitely is very interesting if I think of it in polyphony, and that being a representation of some sort of multi-layered experience that is not so cut and clear, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, yeah, something. It's actually it's very interesting for me as well. This way to think, because I love this exchange. By the way, this is super enjoyable. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking. It's if we are thinking about the visual world, so I think for me it's really this multi layers, as you said, and maybe that's just making me think there must be so much beyond it that I'm trying to find. And then when I'm thinking about, for example, visual painters of that time, for example, Caravaggio, he's treating light in a very special way. Like there is all of these
Mm.
angles of light that wouldn't actually exist. So he's using the imagination in in a very special way. And I think that also he's rebelling all the time, like the themes of his paintings. Sometimes he would put, a person that's not so prominent on the basis of the community, and that was usually the small cities. And everything has been a little bit under the control of the church, and unfortunately sometimes painters and artists were under the control a lot, and there was a lot of having to be
Mm,
commissioned and then having to
that's true.
obliged to the form as and
Yeah.
what is allowed to be painted about and what isn't, and what could be some kind of transgression against the what Bible is, some kind of interpretation. And so in
Huh.
that sense, I'm thinking, and again, of course, we all idealize all of these periods. Who knows how it was until we get the time machine going? We probably
Exactly.
won't be able to, and it's so different. I mean, still there is quite a number of centuries that's separating us. But yeah, for me, I think somehow even of the rebelliousness of that time, but without, now this is interesting. I thought it now just crossed mind when you were talking about the romantic periods and how the emotions, because obviously in the emotions are kind of being much more free flowing in this
Yeah.
time, and they're taking a totally different dimension, whereas in Baroque I think that they are more directed towards something different, something more internal, something, um, I don't know how to explain it. They are more in the um, underneath the control. I don't know of the
But
ideals.
they're much
Maybe.
more, I think, much more controlled, and I think also music in the Baroque period was very much tied to the church.
Yes.
Also, there was a huge element of that, and really showing the reference through music for something higher than the material is definitely there. But I understand now what you mean by this kind of rebelliousness that you see as being similar between the Baroque and the 20th century, because I see it from just what is presented, and what is presented is what they're allowed to show, right? They're not
Right.
allowed to show certain aspects, which might include some of their rebellious thoughts and nature about the way society runs. So when you mention paintings and how you see, I remember slightly from my very tiny minuscule knowledge I've gotten from art history class in college, was they always try to innovate one thing very small, but it was very revolutionary at the time, and to kind of slowly inch their way and rebel against certain norms that were set in place. And so in that sense I could understand why you think they're quite similar between Bach's music and the 20th century. But to kind of think about going forward, how do you see technology influencing that experience? Because you mentioned a lot about space and time. It is completely weird that I can talk to you. You know, you're halfway across the world,
Exactly.
and so what kind of world do we live in where space and time does it? Uh, yeah, is there a distinction in space and time? There's a lot. I You probably have read writings by Benjamin. I remember there were uh, writings about photography, how that influenced our experience of time and memory, and what that encapsulates, what it freezes, what it does not capture, and how it affects our interaction with ordinary objects to pieces of art. And that's kind of where all of this YouTube thing started, was me thinking there's that missing human elements, because obviously we don't have access to Bach and we can't call him up. So uh, it's a way for me to try to connect the two somehow, between the modern society and the older, not even old, but like almost ancient eras to our, compared to our present day in 21st century. So yeah, I'm interested in
Yeah, so
your thoughts.
that's a super that's a super question. Actually, yeah, when we are thinking about the technology and how, as you said, we have, like, already for quite a number of decades, we have this possibility to talk to each other in real time, and it's absolutely fascinating. And then especially in connection to the arts, both music and visual arts and everything else, and in general about education and learning. It's what fascinates me, this concept, this aspect of universalizing, of having it accessible by everybody, literally. So it's the first time, I think, in the history of the humanity, we can actually universalize the knowledge. It's accessible, it's there, and it doesn't cost because everybody, most people are, in fact, sharing so much more thanks to the technology. And that's one of the reasons I was absolutely fascinated with your behind the scenes. And it's always, when you're so, because it's a generous, it's an act of kindness. I always think, when we are filming something, recording, and then just willing to share it without anything in return, really, we are speaking to, somebody in Africa or somebody in India, China, and so all of these places that, and they're maybe just seeing the world. And I think seeing the world through somebody else's eyes, and it helps us walk through their shoes. And this is
Yeah.
the basis of empathy. So I think it's at this point of our civilization where the technology is making us so powerful. Just if we think about, for example, this computer, only I think maybe 20 or more, 30 years ago, it would require the entire room, maybe more actually, sorry,
Yeah, yeah, I know.
for
Yeah.
entire
I
room
remember
in,
like gigantic room.
yeah.
Yeah, my father used to tell me how because I was born right at the crux when things were becoming more accessible for like smaller homes. Windows 95, 97 was around that time. So yeah, there's definitely a lot has changed in the past 20 something years. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, so all of this, I think, is such a positive change, and in a sense, that's what we can do. But at the same time, there is a bit of danger, like with everything. We have all of the algorithms, and while sometimes they help, sometimes they're a little bit evil. And to that end, I've been reading some the books by Jaron Lanier. He's a technologist, futurist, and he's been really tackling these aspects of the behavioral manipulation, which sometimes we are subject to with all of the algorithms. And I'm thinking, because and now we are coming to the question of materiality and commercializing the views and the clicks and all of this kind of stuff. And how do you condition the person to keep watching something, or to keep buying things? And I think we are really beyond that point, in terms of where we are as a civilization, but we still have that. It's still constantly practiced. And then when I think about classical music, because I diverted now a little bit, when we think about the classical music in this context, I think that we are going to be going through this stage of maybe empathy, or giving more classical musicians will probably, especially now as a result of pandemic. I mean, the whole art world has been desperately affected. But on a bright side, more people have to use technology in order to connect with the audience, and maybe to broaden the audience. And in that sense, I think that when it comes to classical music, it's more like philosophy book, rather than, it's which is again connected to what both of us have been always enjoying reading. And um, and but for that, again, we need a bit of guidance, and that's where I think the pieces are going to work out for the best. But it will be a process, and so I really appreciate what you are doing, not only personally but also with classical foundation, because that's kind of broadening. It's making, like, literally, when I read demystified the classical music, I thought, oh my god, this is what I've been saying for a long time. It has to be demystified. It's not something, I like to live stream. So as I'm live streaming just my practicing session, and then it's in real time. And I love this sense of real time. I don't know what it is. It's just, something, even though sometimes I expose myself to all sorts, but it's exciting, sometimes there is very interesting conversation that just out of the blue there could be any topic that we could be touching upon and exploring. And but it's also, and then sometimes people say, why classical, that's for old people or something, something like that. And I'm absolutely discouraged in that moment, and I think, why is it still alive if it's just, for some but yeah, I think that actually probably more people will be acquainted with classical music and art in general. Perceiving the artwork, visual artwork, as for what it is rather than just decoration or a piece of furniture. So it's an interesting world we are living in. So
Yeah, definitely. I mean, without technology, you and I would not have connected. So,
exactly.
we definitely, I do appreciate so much of your idealist interpretation of how technology influences classical music, because I see also a lot of the negative sides when you mention the algorithm and also this um, thirst for monetizing
Yeah.
the things that we do. And I was just thinking yesterday how I never did any of the things that I started doing because I wanted that to be how I pay my rent or how I um, yeah, support myself. But then somehow it just morphed into this thing where that is my career and my life and my entire uh yeah, my entire life essentially. So it's definitely a very interesting process of evolution. One thing I guess I will ask as the ending point, you mentioned you envision that we need some kind of guidance to continue developing this empathy and our interaction with classical music. Do you have any sense of how that guidance would look like? Because there's so many aspects involved, and there's the good and the bad. So, what makes you think that we would go into the uh,
Uh,
better world, if that's not to say that in a snobbish way, but
right.
how what kind of guidance do you envision going
Yes.
into the
Okay, more like a helping.
I guess.
I understand.
Yeah.
So it's when I say guidance, I actually mean, I don't believe in some kind of a guide above and then it's just directing, pulling all of the strings. I mean more in the sense like probably more individuals will make an impact. I like to say, actually, this is something I wrote in my artist statement, that we are all little Prometheuses and we are holding the fire, and we want to give it
Mm,
to somebody. And maybe sometimes you'll get punished for it because that's what happened to. But I think that once it becomes decentralized, because I think algorithms are a little bit centralizing, and then of course there is something that's really a little bit irritating. There is a lot of hacks, people sometimes use, and that of course will affect somebody who is genuinely, like trying to contribute. And then somebody would be trying, and because people just try to figure their way out how to hack the system, how to get on the top of
yeah.
things and so on. And so lately I've been kind of trying to find the apps that actually have a more humane aspects.
Oh,
And one of the apps that I actually have been live streaming for a long time, and I created quite a big audience, couple actually 30,000 people, and this was for 5 years, is shutting down. It's Twitter's
oh.
Periscope. I don't know if you ever used it.
Uh,
Yeah,
I
but
never used it, but I knew of it. Oh, I completely forgot that it was shutting down. That makes sense.
yeah.
That I have not heard of it for a while, but
Yeah,
yeah.
so it was actually this month it's shutting off, and it's a bit disappointment. And like, why is it happening? And I suppose it's a combination of numbers and so many things, and they would just want to develop maybe Twitter in a better, and it's still going to stay as a technology. But a lot of the people that dedicated kind of open sourcing their worlds have been affected and just have to migrate now. And but then I found another app that has a very as opposed to, I mean, Periscope was highly algorithmic powered. It had the cortex that's picking up all of these elements, and then sometimes it would, how it goes. And but this app, which is a startup, has is building a community, and has the people. Actually, the people I in front and behind it, as opposed to the robots. So I am thinking now that probably that's going to be the more and more the future for our technology, because everything is centralizing now. Less and less people can create greater and greater things. That's how I'm seeing in terms of coding and just making things and creating the vision and making it a reality. The connection between immaterial and material, the vision and what's happening, how it's going to affect the world. And the apps that actually have more of the humane that want to develop is probably going to be the future, but it's a long road. It's a slow
Yeah, definitely.
transformation.
That's I love to end on this note because I always think exactly how you're thinking, with every person holding their little torch and really having the responsibility and carrying a small bit, and somehow collectively we can make a bigger change. But I probably not be alive, but when we have that transition away from the algorithm and the AI, because I think the world is still very fascinated with artificial intelligence, and I feel like until we pass that point
Right.
and the whatever the ultimate AI system is, it's at that point that we would come back to, oh, maybe it's better to have the humans to be in the back and in the front. That kind of concept we have
Exactly.
for a future app. Will app even exist in year 2500? I don't know.
That's a good question. Probably some kind of interface, a brain interface. Maybe we'll also have transhumanism. I like to read all of
Yeah,
these ideas.
so many things. Posthumanism, yeah. Oh, so many things. I could go on talking with you forever. But thank you. This is really enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was a very lovely conversation, only possible thanks to technology. So thank you, Irina, for coming on to Classical Chats. I hope you enjoyed listening or watching this episode either on YouTube or on whichever streaming platform of your choice. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube if you would like to follow on future episodes, and also follow our podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, and whichever streaming platform of your choice for podcasts. Thank you very much. Till next time.